with the noted flutist and music educator Barbara Allen took place on April 21st, 2014. Ms. Allen is my colleague at the Aesthetic Realism Foundation, a not-for-profit cultural and educational foundation in New York City. Together with Ann Fielding, director of the Aesthetic Realism Theatre Company, we teach the class The Opposites in Music at the foundation. Ms. Allen is music director of the theater company, and as its conductor and flutist, she has taken part in performances across the country. Early in the 1940s, Eli Siegel wrote the philosophic masterpiece, Self and World, Definition Press. In it, he shows that reality has a structure akin to what makes for beauty in the arts, the oneness of opposites, and that the questions men and women face in everyday life are aesthetic. In the interview, which now follows, Barbara Allen describes this new and grand education with a focus on the art of which she is a master, the art of the flute. Ms. Allen, you are known both as a performer and as a music educator for your advocacy of the aesthetic realism viewpoint and method. Can you tell us about its main principles?
Yes, certainly. This is the philosophy founded by the great poet and educator Eli Siegel. I had the honor to study with him, and what I learned is the thing which distinguishes my teaching of the flute and what I say about it when I perform publicly. Aesthetic realism has three major principles, each of which is terrifically relevant to flute players and how we approach the delightful, amazing instrument we've chosen. I should add that while I'm speaking here about the flute, I feel it stands for all instruments people have played ever since ancient times, and also those who are playing now. The first principle is every person's deepest desire is to like the world on an honest basis. This, I've seen, is the impulsion behind a person's playing an instrument, say, bringing a wind instrument to his or her lips and blowing across a reed or a mouthpiece. One way of defining the world, according to aesthetic realism, is everything which begins where our fingertips end. The flute certainly begins where our fingertips end, and it stands for the outside world. And how we see that outside world affects very deeply the way we hold the flute and produce the sound that it and we make together. I'll say more of this later.
Good.
The second principle is there is a disposition in every person to think we will be for ourselves by making less of the outside world. This is a description of contempt, which is the great opposition in ourselves to art. In fact, contempt is the cause of all cruelty between people and among nations. I've seen through my own life that if we look on the world, which very much includes people, with a scornful, self-aggrandizing attitude, we hurt our relation to everything, including the instruments we've chosen.
You'll say more about this later?
Definitely. And the third principle, which I see as the most important single statement about aesthetics and its relation to our lives, is this sentence by Eli Siegel. All beauty is a making one of opposites. And the making one of opposites is what we are going after in ourselves. I love this principle, and it is the basis of all my teaching and my study of flute literature.
I know that early in your study with him, you wrote a paper titled The Flute, Lyrical and Pungent. Somewhat later, I had the privilege to be your piano accompanist when it was presented to the public. How did the paper come to be? And what were the surprises to you as you wrote it? The insights into the meaning of the flute you hadn't had before?
In order to answer those questions, I'm going to speak somewhat autobiographically. Though I grew up playing the flute, I'm from the Chicago area, and had some of my biggest emotions doing so, and continued my study at the University of Illinois, developed technically, something began to happen which troubled me very much. As time went on, the tone which I had been praised for became harder, and I developed a constriction in my throat, which made for a guttural sound while I played. I remember vividly one day standing in a room in Spain trying to play the opening passage of Mozart's Concerto in D, going up that first run and trying to hold that high D. The sound was angry and tight. I couldn't bear making this sound. And so just 2 years after college, where I had been rather successful in the music department, I stopped playing altogether. I tried to resign myself to the feeling that the flute would no longer be part of my life. It was, as you can imagine, a terrible thing to feel. Fortunately, it was at that time I returned to the United States and began to study aesthetic realism. It was then I learned that I had developed an attitude to the world, using things I'd seen early in my life to harden myself against things. It was this attitude to the world which was interfering with my life and playing, and I learned it could change. A key question Eli Siegel asked me in one of the first aesthetic realism classes I attended, and to say it was a privilege to study with him is a huge understatement, was, did I see other people as having inner lives as deep and rich as my own? I had not. I saw myself as sensitive, much more sensitive than other people, and I was really not interested in what my father, mother, or the men I knew felt. And it was this attitude of separation from people, not respectfully asking what did they feel, what were they hoping for, that was making me cold, mean, and stopping me from what I most wanted, to play the flute and to be a kind person.
I'm glad you spoke about this. So if I understand you right, you're saying that your flute tone grew harder because your way of seeing the world had become harder.
Yes, I am. The relation of yielding and force needed to produce a beautiful tone I could not have. There is definitely a connection between technique and our attitude to the world. Every technical aspect of approaching the flute, from the angle of the embouchure to breath support to how we use our fingers, is affected by whether we see the world as something to care for, respect, even love, or as something to have contempt for, be cold to, hide from. And what happened next in my study was a very big thing. It was shortly after that class with Eli Siegel, in which he asked me questions about how I saw people, that I read a paper written by Martha Baird, poet, critic of music, a paper with aesthetic realism at its basis. It was later published in Allegro, the newspaper of Local 802, New York City's Musicians Local. The paper was titled Junction and Separation in the Elements of Music. In it, Ms. Baird shows that these opposites, separation and junction, the same opposites I was learning about in myself, are the very heart of music. In fact, she showed they need to be one for a note or even a sound to exist at all. For example, all sounds result from matter meeting matter. Two separate things meet. That is separation and junction, just like that. Also, when moving air passes through the brittle winter branches of a tree, we hear whistling. I'll never forget that early Saturday morning in spring when I was walking down the street and I thought to myself, I wonder how separation and junction are in flute playing. I couldn't get home fast enough. I took out my flute after almost 2 years of barely touching it, and I played the first note. I was amazed. It sounded good. It was me plus the flute. That's junction. And it was the fast-moving air against the solid flute that caused the sound, the likes of which I had not heard just that way before. I began fumblingly to play things mainly in the low register and asked why such a change in the tone? The answer came to me. You care more for the world. you know that through aesthetic realism, you can see the world more as it truly is, as wide, filled with sounds, sights, and people you can see meaning in. The restriction in the throat thousands of flute players and singers worry about was gone. As my attitude toward the world changed, and I liked reality more, this made for physical changes, position changes, a more tender and fuller relation of my embouchure and the silver Haynes flute I had had since high school, and this is the one. I imagine you can understand now why I'm so grateful to Eli Siegel and the philosophy he founded. He was the kindest person I ever met. Mr. Siegel's knowledge was enormous, and he always used it to bring out what was good in every person who studied with him. In my instance, he restored something I thought I'd lost, the ability to play the flute. But even more importantly, I learned from him a new way of seeing the whole world, for which I could respect myself and which made me happy. Seeing my relation through the opposites to reality freed me to play again, and this has continued all the years since.
Well, this is so moving. It's some story.
This leads me directly to the next point, which you asked me about what surprised me most when I worked on that paper on the flute. I learned that music itself shows, in Mr. Siegel's words, what the world is like. Music is not in a separate and better world. The world, aesthetic realism explains, is made aesthetically. It is a oneness of opposites. For instance, a tree is one and many. It has a thick trunk with many branches that move in the wind. Niagara Falls is a oneness of power and grace. There is power as the water plunges from its edge, and also ever so delicate mists radiant in the sun. These opposites, power and grace, are the same opposites that are one in beautiful music, and they need to be one as we play an instrument. They are, and I want to emphasize this, the same opposites we are trying to put together in ourselves. Here I'll mention another principle which in a way I'm illustrating. The world, art, and self explain each other. Each is the aesthetic oneness of opposites. I was excited to see that I was not just blowing across a tube for hours while practicing. I was learning about the structure of the world and also myself at the very same time. At the very same time I was studying my long tones, for instance. Isn't a note one and many at the same time? A single A is 440 vibrations per second. And aren't force and delicacy together as one in the opening passage from Mozart's D Concerto? And this is the passage I couldn't play before.
In your flute classes, I've heard you often quote Eli Siegel's statement, "Music tells what the world is like." Can you say more about why you see this as so important?
I want to stress again that music is not in a separate world. Music is about this world. It is about the world with its pleasure and pain, gentleness and harshness, order and chaos, joy and sadness, love and hate. Bach, Mozart, Duke Ellington were real people who felt reality deeply. And as we play their music on our instruments, we have the honor to try to be close to them, to see and feel how they made beauty of these very opposites. In one aesthetic realism class, Eli Siegel described something particular that made for new thought in me. He said that two of the major opposites important to wind instrumentalists, especially, are advance and retreat. Yes, I said to myself, to blow out is to produce the various tones, is advance. To take air in is retreat. It's one of the largest difficulties all wind instrumentalists have. When is a good time to take a breath? How is the breath to be as deep and full as possible? How can I give the impression that I'm not desperate to breathe while playing, and that there is enough but not too much for each note? The more I thought about the matter of the oneness of advance and retreat, the more I saw how crucial it is for good flute playing. Within each note, there is a oneness of advance and retreat. The low notes are quieter, recessive, but to play them, one must give more air. The high notes have more of the advanced quality or aggressive quality, but to play them well, you have to yield deeply while giving them the exact velocity of air they deserve. Musicians who study aesthetic realism are fortunate to be able to ask consciously and clearly, what does this note deserve? It is not unlike the question Mr. Siegel asked me about how I saw people. Do I grant people what they deserve? Do I want to see their inner lives? Both people and notes have inner lives.
Thank you. I've heard you speak movingly and powerfully about the meaning of instruments per se, not just the flute. Can you talk about this?
It is a wonder to me that human beings have been impelled to play and make musical instruments for over 30,000 years. Recently, in fact, a flute was discovered in what is now Germany that they've dated back 42,000 years. These instruments, from prehistory to the present, are made from materials to be found in the world. Wood, bone, ivory, silver, brass, gold even. And every instrument must be played by a person. So when we hear a note, what we hear is a successful oneness of a person and the world. Opposites we're trying to do a good job with from birth. The first musician and the musician of today have this in common. The instrument is a means of joining oneself to the whole world.
I think that's why musicians can have such deep feelings about their instruments. Love, really.
I agree. And it's the same principle when it comes to love between two people. A feeling you bring me closer to the whole world.
Well, that's an exciting relation.
Yes, it is. And while this is an interview about the flute and how I teach it, you know that I also am a consultant to women in my work at the Aesthetic Realism Foundation. Marriages do depend on it. The need to use a person to feel, as Mr. Siegel put it, closely one with things as a whole. Love of music, love of an instrument, and love of a person have this in common. The world has to be honored.
The connections you're making through the opposites between art and life are wonderful. You spoke earlier about love and marriage, which are like a duet. In our work together, we've spoken of how the melody of the flute and the melody of the right hand of the piano in a Bach sonata have what love needs to have. As they harmonize with each other, they both need to honor the bass line in order really to get along, as two people need to care together for the world.
Yes. To illustrate this, let's play a portion of the third movement of Bach's sonata in E minor. First, we hear the bass line. As the movement begins, we hear the right hand of the piano with that bass line. And then 6 measures later, the flute enters and joins with its melody.
Can you say something more about the meaning of ensemble playing and what makes it good?
In every ensemble, 2 or more instruments join. And when the music is beautiful, they join in such a way they add to each other. This is so important. People in orchestras all over the world feel something as they play together, which is necessary for us to feel in our everyday lives. The drum and the flute are different. And played well, they bring out the strength in each other. A successful ensemble is ethics as beauty. The flute is not saying, I'm more refined and superior to you. The drum isn't saying, I can play more loudly and drown you out. They are different, as people are different, and they need each other. In all ensemble playing, there is an implicit call for each instrumentalist to be faithful to his own part and to have goodwill, that is, hope and work to have other parts stronger. The beauty that results when 90 people and their instruments are playing, say, Brahms' First Symphony, stands for the ethics we need as we think about each other, how women should see men, and men women, how we should see people of different nations or skin tones.
Are you saying that we can learn from music about one of the big things troubling America now, racism?
Definitely. I brought to this interview a passage from the periodical The Right of Aesthetic Realism to be Known, written by Ellen Reese, Aesthetic Realism Chairman of Education, which I care for very much, and which stands for what people in America can learn from music about one of the toughest and most urgent matters facing us. Will you read what she writes in issue 1264?
Certainly. Quote, what needs to replace racism is not the feeling that the difference of another person is somehow tolerable. What is necessary is the seeing and feeling that the relation of sameness and difference between ourselves and that other person is beautiful. People need to feel, with feeling both intimately personal and large, that the difference of race is like the difference to be found in music. 2 notes are different, but they are in behalf of the same melody. They complete each other. Each needs the other to be expressed richly, to be fully itself, unquote. That is great. Can you expand on what you mentioned earlier, that a person's attitude towards the world affects the sound he or she makes on the flute, whether one's purpose is to respect reality or have contempt?
Yes, let me approach it by first mentioning a passage from Theobald Boehm's book, The Flute and Flute Playing in Acoustical, Technical, and Artistic Aspects, and then place Boehm's scientific finding with what I've observed in myself and in my students. The place a flute player most intimately meets the instrument is with the mouth, the embouchure. The way the lips are formed has a great deal to do with how precisely and how richly the air meets the instrument. When we're in a debate between having contempt for the outside world, sneering at it, which is done with the lips, and having respect for it, even wonder, this debate will affect the sounds we make. And I think the effect of contempt for the world is what Theobald Bohm is documenting when he wrote this in 1872. Would you read this passage, please?
Experience shows that all woodwind instruments are affected by the manner of blowing, so that they become either better or worse with regard to the tones and their production. The reasons for this have never yet been satisfactorily explained. The best flute loses an easy speech by overblowing, and its bright, clear quality of tone by a bad embouchure, and conversely, gains in speech and tone by a correct handling and a good embouchure.
Thank you.
Welcome.
The purpose of every flute lesson I give, either to classes or to an individual, is to encourage my students to use learning about the instrument to know and like reality, which very much includes people. In an early lesson, I've quoted these sentences to my students from Eli Siegel's Self and World. It's from chapter 3, The Aesthetic Method in Self-Conflict. These are the sentences.
Quote, "We all of us start with a here, ever so snug and ever so immediate. And this here is surrounded strangely, endlessly by a there. We are always meeting this there. In other words, we are always meeting what is not ourselves, and we have to do something about it. We have to be ourselves and give to this great and diversified there, which is not ourselves, what it deserves," unquote.
There are various technical things which arise from what these sentences describe, and which make for sound which is either good or not. For instance, as we hold the flute, our right hand goes towards the world, there. Our left hand goes towards us, here. Our attitude towards what is there affects how we position our hands. Sometimes I've seen students pull back the right hand, and as soon as this happens, the tone is stifled. The triangle of left, right hand, and embouchure has to be beautiful in such a way that the flute is the thing that stands forth, not oneself, not one's mouth. So you can get a better tone, and I hope I can do it now. When that happens. What we want is to be ever so close to the instrument, and at the same time honor, care for the fact that it joins us to what is outside. The notes that Bach wrote, or Gluck, and Bach wrote them in 1732. It is a great feeling when this happens. So I've talked about these opposites, here and there, turning in and turning out, force and gentleness. And of course there are others I could mention, including firmness and flexibility. But the main thing is, it is the oneness of opposites we're looking for every moment in life. And good flute playing comes from this aesthetic imperative, utter yielding and giving oneself to the music without any ego disproportion, at the same time, at the same moment as we are showing who we are in our fullness, engaging the music with all of ourselves, our best mind, and our deepest and most sincere feelings.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. Is there anything you would like to say in conclusion?
Yes, and thank you, too, for this interview. I would like to close by quoting sentences about the flute by Mr. Siegel, which I love. When I first heard them, I felt how beautiful they are, as though they were speaking for the flute and its purpose.
Quote, "There are as many as 40 pairs of opposites that, if one hears diligently, one can find in the music of the flute. Even the magic flute of Mozart had expansion and restraint at once, had energy and delicacy, had resonance and piercingness, had high and low, was straight and casual. Furthermore, when Barbara Allen plays the flute, she is herself, and simultaneously perhaps at one with a composer of the 17th century, or of 1850, or of a few years ago.
And he continues, and the flute is such a wonderful mingling, amazing oneness of sadness and cheerfulness. The flute is springy and can sound like the everlasting complaint of one bird in one wilderness coping with the justice of God. If we looked at the literature of the flute, we would reach 40, and more too, instances of the flute being of various mode, accompanied by an intellectual and human pleasure, of showing how the world we have, and which others once had, is present in the possibilities of the graceful instrument which begins and ceases with such fetching and powerful subtlety, unquote. So to conclude, we'd like to play Gluck's Dance of the Blessed Spirits, which is from his opera Orpheus and Eurydice, and which we feel has some of the qualities Mr. Siegel described here.